January 1848. The frozen river creaked beneath 10-year-old Barnabé's feet as he desperately fled across the ice that covered the Miramichi River, his thin shoes barely protecting him from the biting cold. Each labored breath escaped in clouds that dissolved into the dark New Brunswick night. Freedom pulsed in his chest, the memory of his father's arms, the scent of home just a few kilometers away. Behind him lay Sheldrake Island, its rough-hewn buildings silhouetted against the moonlight, a place of suffering where guards patrolled its perimeter and the sick cared for the dying. Barnabé had known little beyond isolation, pain, and the constant whisper of waves against the shoreline. He could still smell the death and decay, a scent that permeated well beyond the lonely island's deceptively serene-looking shorelines. His fingers, some already numb from disease, others from frost, clutched his tiny little jacket. Though his body was failing him, hope drove him forward. One step, then another, toward the distant light of his father's window. Then he heard their shouts. "You, boy, get back here!" His little heart sank. Tears started to roll down his scarred face, but he wasn't turning back. Not this time. Brave young Barnabé's desperate dash would sadly be his last. Hello and welcome to Pinecone Diaries, Canada's Stories and History. I'm your host, Craig Rourke. Today's story shines a light on a hidden chapter of Canadian history. For more than a century, few people knew what happened to 44 individuals, most of them Acadian, who developed a rare and poorly understood disease in early 19th century New Brunswick. That disease was leprosy, now known as Hansen's disease. Their story is one of human suffering, sacrifice, and strength. Today, leprosy isn't something that comes up in most conversations in Canada. When it does, it often brings to mind bleak images from medieval times, isolated figures visibly disfigured and wrapped in bandages to hide their wounds. Pop culture often still reinforces this negative image. Take, for example, the movie Braveheart, where Robert the Bruce's father is shown as the leper, isolated and morally corrupted. It was exactly this kind of stigma that persisted when leprosy appeared in Canada in the early 1800s. The disease caused painful ulcers, lesions, and infected boils. As it progressed, the skin could break down, and in some cases, patients required amputations to try to slow its spread. In other cases, extremities slowly deteriorated and fell off as the disease advanced, causing permanent damage to nerves, skin, eyes, and nose. Understandably, people were afraid of those who were afflicted, but that fear often turned into something much more harmful. It didn't help that all kinds of false beliefs were also circulating. Many thought leprosy only affected people who were morally corrupt, poor, or even cursed. In reality, the people who became ill were ordinary individuals, parents, children, neighbors, and friends. They had done nothing wrong and simply had the misfortune of getting sick. But biblical references created long-standing associations with impurity, sin, and banishment. As we'll soon see, these beliefs were used to justify the cruel treatment of those who became ill. Leprosy has existed in parts of the world for centuries. In most of North America, however, it remained extremely rare by the 18th and 19th centuries. So, when cases surfaced in the northeastern region of New Brunswick, the communities there didn't have much experience or understanding of how this disease spread. Doctors of the early 1800s couldn't explain it clearly, and ordinary people were baffled by how it had even got there. Some believed it came in with outsiders, shipwrecked sailors along coastal New Brunswick who encountered Acadians trying to rebuild their lives there, or others blamed returning Acadians who had taken refuge in Louisiana and brought the disease back when they returned following their 1755 expulsion. There were also legendary stories about a mysterious stranger whose presence supposedly brought the affliction to an unsuspecting village. To this day, the exact source of the first cases to show up in New Canada remains uncertain. By the early 19th century, a cluster of leprosy cases had appeared in the Miramichi and Acadian Peninsula regions of New Brunswick. Many who contracted it experienced the visible skin lesions, nerve damage, and sometimes disfigurement mentioned earlier. Because modern medicine didn't yet exist in the form we now know, people who saw these symptoms felt an immense amount of fear. In some parts of Europe at the time, leprosy patients were allowed in mainstream hospitals, but in New Brunswick, stigma and alarm took hold. Officials saw leprosy as a near biblical curse that could ravage entire families and maybe even entire communities. Once local authorities believed leprosy might spread, they were quick to bring in harsh measures to isolate the infected. To understand why this harsh approach fell so heavily on Acadians, it helps to recall their background. The Acadians, descended from French settlers who colonized Acadia, or in French, Acadie, in the 17th and 18th centuries. They developed a distinct identity by blending their French heritage with indigenous influences, particularly the Mi'kmaq, in farming, trade, and resistance to British control. It was this resistance to British authority that infuriated colonial leaders and led them to view Acadians with deep suspicion. Acadians were also largely Catholic, while British settlers were primarily Protestant, and clashes between the two ideologies were common. Sadly, Acadians became easy scapegoats and were treated as less than after enduring decades of mistreatment in what some now recognize as an early example of ethnic cleansing. Local oral tradition tells us that the first person who showed signs of leprosy in New Brunswick was a woman named Ursule Landry, who later married and became known as Ursule Benoit. Ursule was from Tracadie, a fishing community in northeastern New Brunswick. She started noticing patches of rough, scaly skin sometime around 1817 to 1818. At first, no one identified it as leprosy, but by the time she died in 1828, it was clear she had been suffering from something that matched the descriptions of the disease. Over the next 2 decades, more cases popped up quietly among her extended family and neighbors, although people often hid the illness for fear of gossip, shame, and ostracization. In many Acadian households, when someone began showing frightening symptoms, families would quietly care for them in isolation, often setting up a small hut on the edge of their property, away from everyone else. This was done partly out of love and a desire to protect their own, and partly out of fear that outsiders or even local authorities might find out. Medical help was scarce, doctors were few and far between, and those who were available often refused to treat anyone with signs of leprosy, fearing for their own safety. So families were left to navigate the illness on their own, doing the best they could with what little they had. And although people in and around Tracadie tried to keep suspected cases secret, these communities were small, and word inevitably got out. By 1842, parish priests in the region were raising alarms about leprosy clusters, especially in communities like Tracadie. One priest, Father Francois Xavier Lafrance, wrote to colonial officials. He noted that an old disease was making its presence felt and that his parishioners had nowhere to turn. Since many Acadians trusted the church more than British government authorities, it fell to priests like Lafrance to advocate on their behalf. The local government, now aware of multiple cases among the French-speaking Acadians, set up a commission of doctors in 1844 to confirm these rumors. A physician named Dr. Alexander Key and his colleagues investigated. They found 18 people living with confirmed leprosy, including some as young as 8 years old. The doctor noted that it was spreading within certain families, many of whom could trace their ancestry back to Ursule Benoit. Worried that the number of cases would grow, they concluded that the province needed a strong intervention. In April 1844, the provincial legislature passed what they named an Act to Prevent the Spread of a Disorder now existing in certain parts of the counties of Gloucester and Northumberland. It sounds sterile, but it had very real consequences. It authorized the Board of Health to create a lazaretto, which is essentially a quarantine station. The law allowed anyone suspected of having the disease to be detained by force at the lazaretto. If you tried to hide a sick relative, you could face fines or, in some cases, more severe punishments. The Board of Health chose Sheldrake Island as the site for this new lazaretto. Sheldrake Island is located at the mouth of the Miramichi River, where the river empties into Miramichi Bay before flowing into the Gulf of St. Lawrence. This little island covers approximately 32 acres and is roughly 13 kilometers or 8 miles from the former town of Chatham, New Brunswick. This may not seem that far away from the mainland, but it was downriver enough that it was still fairly remote back then. Part of the reason Sheldrake Island was chosen was that it had a few empty buildings there, left over from a previous cholera quarantine site, and it was, for the most part, unpopulated. And so on July 19th, 1844, authorities rounded up 18 Acadians suffering from leprosy, ranging in age from 8 years old to middle-aged adults. Families were torn apart in the process, with parents separated from children, spouses separated from each other, and close kinship relations left tattered. These initial 18 individuals, 4 men, married and fathers, one of whom had 7 children, 3 brothers aged 15, 21, and 23, and their sister with her newborn, who was also a mother of 5, 2 brothers aged 12 and 21, 2 unmarried men aged 15 and 23, 1 married woman, mother of 4, another woman, mother of 7, along with her son, Barnabé, 2 pregnant women, one a mother of 6, the other a mother of 4, and 1 girl, Marie Rose, were placed on boats, some willingly and some by force, ferried to Sheldrake, and told they would spend the rest of their days in quarantine there, while being cared for as they lived out their remaining days in relative peace. Some accounts compared this devastating moment to a living funeral, suggesting that a few people were declared dead, in a ritual sense at least. The sick held on to a faint hope of recovery, believing they might someday return to the mainland and rejoin their families and the lives they had left behind. But deep down, most people knew there was no plan to repatriate the exiled. Officials defended this forced quarantine by insisting it was necessary for public health. They believed that if these afflicted people remained in their villages, leprosy would spread and become an even greater threat. As painful and terrifying as it was, many of the sick believed it was a necessary step to protect their families and, in some cases, prevent the disease from wiping out entire bloodlines. But Sheldrake Island was hardly a place of peace or comfort. The existing buildings were described as dark, poorly ventilated, infested with vermin, and unheated, making them far too cold for New Brunswick's harsh winters. Early on, there was no resident physician assigned to the island either. The government provided minimal rations. Some accounts mention how a local official or overseer would drop off weekly provisions of food and firewood at a designated spot, then hurry away without any face-to-face interaction with the patients. Essentially, these people were left to care for each other, even though many had advanced stages of the disease. Once they were isolated on the island, it quickly became clear that there was no real plan of care. The group didn't even have access to clean water and were forced to dig their own well. The only personnel the government provided were guards, stationed at the far end of the island, far away from the quarantine buildings. Their job was simply to prevent patients from escaping and to keep visitors from coming ashore. The already bleak conditions on Sheldrake rapidly deteriorated. Patients were crammed into small spaces, with almost no medical supplies. It's no surprise, then, that not everyone who arrived on Sheldrake Island willingly accepted their fate. Just a few months into the quarantine, 2 men escaped, although one did return willingly. In July 1845, 2 more men and 2 brothers fled on makeshift rafts, but the younger brother was recaptured and forced to return. Colonial officials responded to such breakouts by seeking more power to punish runaways, increasing patrols and building a tall, spiked fence around the compound. It no longer felt like a hospital or even a place of quarantine. Perhaps it never had. Now, it felt like a fortress designed for containment, not for treatment. On October 16, 1845, some patient prisoners who were desperate and fed up with their predicament set fire to the main dormitory of the lazaretto. Perhaps they hoped this would force the government to abandon the colony, but the authorities simply rebuilt the structures on Sheldrake, and the colony remained. By February 1846, the lazaretto had received 20 individuals affected with leprosy, and the first baby was born there. During that same period, 3 patients died, 1 man and 2 boys aged 12 and 15. The survivors were left to endure food shortages, intense winter cold, and the emotional burden of being cut off from the rest of humanity. Some local Acadians, ignoring official warnings, did try to help, sneaking food and firewood onto the island by boat or dragging supplies over the ice in winter. Without this grassroots support, those isolated there might have suffered even more. Records indicate that a year later, by early 1847, 6 patients in total had died, and only 9 were left on the island. 2 more died later that year, and 1 man escaped. As winter approached that year, officials estimated there were at least 18 lepers at large, fueling public concern that leprosy would creep towards their towns. The sense of isolation and hopelessness on Sheldrake must have been overwhelming. The stronger among the men, women, and children trapped there continued trying to tend to weaker patients. Some described it as a prison rather than a hospital. During the early months of 1848, there were 9 individuals, 4 men, 3 mothers, a 16-year-old girl, and the young boy named Barnabé, who were sequestered on Sheldrake. By the end of that year, 12 new cases had been admitted, and 4 more people had died. 1 woman, the mother who had given birth at the lazaretto, and 3 males, including Barnabé, who was just 11 years old. Barnabé's story was especially tragic. He had escaped from the island a few times since arriving there against his will, and once managed to make it all the way across the frozen river and return to his father's embrace. Sadly, that reunion was short-lived. Authorities soon tracked him down and dragged him back. Worried he would flee again, they allegedly chained him to his bed. He died shortly after, probably all alone, chained to his bed, suffering in silence. He was buried on the island. News of his death would have been sent to his family, who couldn't come to claim his body, or say a final goodbye, or hold a small graveside service. They couldn't even make a visit to his grave, which was marked by a simple wooden cross. Among the 12 cases admitted at the end of 1848 were 2 individuals who had escaped earlier and then returned, 2 children, Pierre, aged 10, and Mélanie, aged 9, whose mother had died at the lazaretto 2 months earlier, and 2 young men, aged 18 and 21. Altogether, 17 people remained quarantined at Sheldrake at the beginning of 1849. As the disease progressed in those afflicted, many patients developed painful ulcers and infections. One visiting doctor wrote in 1849 that he was horrified by the stench of decay and could barely bring himself to approach the patients. Outside, critics called the island lazaretto a medieval approach that did more harm than good. You can't help but think of the history of the Acadians here. Less than a century earlier, many of their ancestors had been deported from Nova Scotia in a campaign that destroyed communities, separated families, and left deep scars. Now they were seeing their relatives once again forcibly removed, this time in the name of a quarantine. A small handful of those quarantined on Sheldrake were not Acadians, but the majority were, feeding the perception that they were being singled out for their French and Catholic ways. Leprosy became labeled by some as an Acadian disease, which fed into old stereotypes that Acadians were backward or prone to illness because of intermarriage or interbreeding. Meanwhile, certain members of the medical community, including Dr. Robert Baird, blasted the Sheldrake Island scheme as medieval in its cruelty. Another doctor, Dr. Alexander Boyle, noted that by the mid 1800s in Europe, hospitals had begun treating leprosy patients alongside other patients. He believed it was largely not contagious and argued that forcibly isolating people was both inhumane and ineffective. These dissenting voices cited genealogical links, suggesting that many of the Acadian cases were in the same families, indicating inherited susceptibility or shared environmental factors rather than casual spread. But in the 1840s, fear was stronger than empathy. Many who lived outside the afflicted regions were afraid that if they didn't round up leprosy patients, the disease would spread across the province. That fear led officials to keep Sheldrake running, despite outcry from some doctors, Acadian leaders, and Catholic clergy. By 1848, however, the conditions on Sheldrake Island had become a scandal. Government inspectors were finally sent to examine the lazaretto and found it in a deplorable state. Officials argued among themselves about whether to improve the place, close it, or find another option altogether. Eventually, pressure from the Acadian community, allied clergy, and critical voices in the press pushed the province to close the island colony. A plan started to take shape to move everyone to a new facility on the mainland in 1849, 5 years after Sheldrake Island first opened its gates. Authorities arranged to relocate the remaining leprosy patients. Father Lafrance, who had been calling for government intervention for years, oversaw the transfer and ensured it was done in a more respectful way than the original forced removal of people from their homes. This time, the patients headed for a newly built lazaretto in Tracadie, closer to their home villages, so family members could at least bring them supplies and visit more easily. It was still a quarantine, but no longer on an isolated island. On July 25, 1849, 14 patients were finally transferred off the island. Between 1844 and 1849, 15 people had died and were buried on Sheldrake Island. By the end of the decade, Sheldrake Island stood as a stark example of how fear, prejudice, and limited science shaped the province's response to leprosy, leaving a painful legacy for the 44 Acadians whose lives were torn apart by exile and misunderstanding. Contemporary observers noted that the Tracadie Lazaretto was somewhat better, though still far from ideal. It was a wooden building with several small wards, but at least it had heat. For the first few years, staff and resources remained limited. Still, relocating patients closer to their home communities had helped ease some of the tension. In the 1850s, authorities began to provide actual medical supervision. In 1863, the Tracadie Lazaretto welcomed its first resident doctor, Dr. James M. Nicholson. A few years later, in 1868, 7 Catholic nuns from the Religious Hospitallers of St. Joseph arrived. Their presence marked a major turning point. The sisters bandaged wounds, prepared basic medicines, food, and living conditions, offering care and compassion where there had once only been isolation and fear. For the first time, leprosy patients were treated as people. They were seen as someone's mother, daughter, sister, brother, father, son, or friend, thanks to the kindness of these caring women. Meanwhile, Sheldrake Island was left behind and largely forgotten. The old buildings either burned, collapsed, or were dismantled. Only a small cemetery remained to bear witness to the 15 people, including men, women, and children, who had died there. Leprosy persisted in the region throughout the rest of the 19th century, mostly affecting a small number of interconnected families. As medical research progressed, doctors identified the bacterium responsible for the disease, M. leprae, in 1873. By the 1950s, effective antibiotics had made leprosy treatable. By the mid 20th century, the disease had faded from the region. With no more patients to care for, the Tracadie Lazaretto closed in 1965 after treating approximately 90 patients. But for more than 100 years, it had shaped the community around Tracadie and left a lasting imprint on many Acadian families. The Sheldrake Island leprosy forced confinement story fits into a larger theme of how authorities in the 1800s handled disease outbreaks. Whether it was cholera, smallpox, or leprosy, the first move was usually quarantine. Science was in its early stages, so fear often guided many decisions. The idea that you could forcibly remove people to protect the healthy harkened back to medieval practices. Lepers had long been forced to live apart, sometimes even made to ring bells to warn others of their approach. Over and over again, societies responded to the disease by pushing sufferers out of sight. Sheldrake was one of the earlier examples of this kind of response in North America, but we must remember it wasn't unique. In the years that followed, other regions handled leprosy similarly. Hawaii famously established the Molokai settlement in 1866. In the 1890s, Chinese immigrant laborers with leprosy were isolated on Darcy Island off Canada's west coast. Several Caribbean islands also created their own leprosy colonies. Over the years, Sheldrake Island has come to occupy a special place in the collective memory of Acadians in northeastern New Brunswick. For some, it represented a new wave of forced exile, echoing the trauma of 1755. They told stories of relatives who died alone, families who faced heartbreak when the sick were removed by law. Descendants preserve stories about the lepers of Sheldrake in family lore, speaking of how entire households were torn apart by what they saw as cruelty disguised as public health. Historians eventually took an interest, sifting through folk legends, genealogies, and official records to piece together what truly happened. And even today, some details are still missing. Not everyone in New Brunswick or the rest of Canada knew about Sheldrake's story. But over time, there has been renewed interest to uncover its history. A group known as the Sheldrake Commemorative Committee worked tirelessly to research Sheldrake Island and its inhabitants and interview people connected to its history. They helped filmmaker Julianne Cadieux create a short documentary titled Sheldrake. The committee contributed to efforts to create an art installation in 2017 meant to bring awareness to the saga. The committee also collaborated with photographer Marika Drolet Ferguson to honor the 15 individuals who died on Sheldrake Island by creating 15 photograph panels, one for each of the deceased, depicting elements of the isolation and environment they experienced on the island. These panels were set up in Tracadie, New Brunswick, near the museum dedicated to the history of leprosy and adjacent to the Cimetière des Lépreux, where a plaque commemorating the deceased was installed. Local descendants of Sheldrake patients, community leaders, and others attended the unveiling, sharing stories and memorializing those who lived and died during that grim chapter. For some descendants, it was a chance at closure, knowing their ancestors' suffering was finally being recognized. Looking back, it's easy to label Sheldrake Island as a relic of an unenlightened past, but it brings up bigger questions that are still relevant today. How do we handle diseases that scare us because we don't fully understand them? Who decides which group of people must be quarantined or forcibly moved? When does a public health measure cross the line into cruelty or discrimination? And what voices get drowned out in the rush to protect a broader community? While leprosy is contagious, we now know it's not easily spread, and modern antibiotics can cure or manage the disease. Prolonged exposure to an untreated individual can increase the risk of transmission, but casual contact rarely leads to an infection. Researchers have also discovered that leprosy can be contracted from environmental sources or certain animals like armadillos in the southern United States. About 95% of people exposed to M. leprae, the bacteria that causes leprosy, will never develop the disease thanks to their immune system's natural defenses. We also now know that leprosy is not directly hereditary. It can't be passed from parent to child through genes. Some Acadian families may have shared genetic traits that made them more susceptible, but other factors like living conditions, nutrition, or damaged immune systems were just as important. We've also recently moved away from using the word leper, which carried centuries of stigma and dehumanization. In Canada today, leprosy is rare, but you may be surprised to learn that it still exists. Except now, those who are diagnosed receive treatment rather than isolation. In 2023, there were 182,815 new cases of leprosy reported worldwide, with 95% of them concentrated in 23 priority countries identified by the World Health Organization. The disease is now closely linked to poverty and limited access to healthcare. In many places, stigma still prevents people from seeking diagnosis and treatment. The WHO's Global Leprosy Strategy, which is in effect from 2021 to 2030, calls for zero disease, zero disability, and zero stigma. It focuses on early detection, timely treatment with multi-drug therapy, and reducing social barriers to health. For Canadians, the memory of Sheldrake Island reminds us that behind official policies, there are real people like the families who quietly looked after their sick in huts, or the little boy who tried to escape back to his father. Each individual had a life and a name, dreams and fears. For every official record, there's a personal story of heartbreak or survival. When you stand on the shore of the Miramichi and look across at Sheldrake Island, you might never guess it was once a place of such heartbreak. The gentle waters and rustling trees give little clues of what once happened there. But if you talk to local Acadians or explore the archives, you'll find accounts of forced removal, dire conditions, and perseverance against almost impossible odds. Those who lived on the island between 1844 and 1849 suffered physically and emotionally, but thankfully their story didn't vanish. It was, and still is, carried forward in their relatives' memories, in continuing discussions about public health and social justice, and in the legacy of the Tracadie Lazaretto that replaced Sheldrake. As we remember the men, women, and children who once lived and died on the quiet island in the Miramichi River, they remind us that compassion matters, especially in times of fear. I'd like to thank you for listening to this story from a forgotten chapter in Canada's history. Please consider leaving a rating or a review. Your feedback will help me plan for future improvements and other stories to cover. And then, have a rad rest of your day.